is Peter Cartier, and I'd like to welcome you to Fpweb.net's 6th Fpwebinar. So thanks for taking the time to join us. We started this short to-the-point webinar series in the summer. It was all to basically give you answers to support questions or problems that we thought we could solve and start a conversation around, all based on topics of interest that you might have. And as I always start these things, we just want you to get acquainted with the GoToWebinar screen in front of you. There's a chat area where you can send us any questions that you have throughout the webinar. We're also monitoring Twitter, so use the hashtag Fpwebinar to leave any questions or comments there. Today we are talking about migrating your SharePoint, and with a steady temperature of 5 degrees Fahrenheit and snow on the ground here at St. Louis, I almost wish we were talking about migrating climates. But nevertheless, I have a couple of great guys here with me. They're going to make sense of this migration process for you, share some of the best practices, and we'll go over a quick summary of what you're going to learn, but a couple reminders real quick as well. These Fpwebinars, they're Fpweb.net's webinars, and they pack all of the information about the topic that we can in basically the time it takes to cook a pizza, because that's the easiest way for me to tell time. We're going to explore those best practices in a high-level overview, and then we always open it up to a question and answer section at the end, and that's when we can address any specific pain points that you might have or any questions that you have about the topic. So they are recorded, and these will live on the site soon afterwards, so we'll also send them your way via email. So watch it over and over and over again if you like, or just send it along to somebody else that you think it might help. We appreciate that. One last thing before we get started, we're once again giving away a copy of the Microsoft Office Professional 2013. That's going to go to one lucky attendee that's present throughout the presentation. It's a $400 value, so pretty nice, and all of you online with us right now are eligible, so good luck to you. So what's in this Fpwebinar? Basically, our guys are going to define a migration process. We're going to have some questions you need to think about before you migrate. We're going to figure out what data needs to stay and what can be cleared out, what to expect, and different methods that you can use, issues you might run into, and why, after all this, would you migrate. So without further ado, I'd like to present our presenters, Mr. Joe Beyer and Mr. Jesse Roche. Gentlemen.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everybody. As Peter mentioned, I'm Joe Beyer. For those new attendees out there, I'll just quickly go over some of my primary roles here. I am one of these senior SharePoint administrators here. I do a lot of the builds and migrations, and I've probably done about 75 migrations, give or take. So I've pretty much seen quite a bit when it comes to migrations. I also manage the build process, and lastly, I'm a point of escalation for our support team.
Okay, thanks everybody for joining today. As Peter mentioned, my name is Jesse. He also told me I had to make this short because I talk too much. So basically what I've done here is a little bit of everything, from managing our support team to creating our relationship manager team to my current role, which is VP of Sales, and that's where I work with a lot of our new customers. So one thing that comes up quite a bit, really in just about every conversation I have, is the topic of migrations. So we're going to kind of jump right in with the basics before Joe kind of goes and gets all technical on us. We're going to start with what is a migration. It's really just moving data, users, sometimes even web parts and farm solutions from version to version. So it's just upgrading from a previous version of SharePoint. That seems pretty simple on the surface, but I'm going to tell just a quick, or at least somewhat quick, story about kind of what can go wrong. So we had a customer that had hired some consultants to come in and migrate their current on-premise 2007 MOS environment, and they were bringing it to us and wanted to do, obviously a hosted SharePoint 2010 environment. We had gone through and worked with them to build up a new farm. We had handed it off to the customer, and then basically the consultants took over with the migration. Our relationship managers had basically checked in with the customer periodically, and what they found was there was very little usage on the new servers. So that obviously sent up some red flags on our side. When we talked to them, they said they were having some issues with the migration, but the consultants were still working on it. To kind of make a long story short, we had basically had to come in and do several restores in the environment from the migration efforts, and we're probably about 10 months in at this point, and the customer is actually looking to move away from SharePoint since they were kind of stuck on 2007. At that point, we basically had to step in. We asked Joe to provide a statement of work that, yes, the migration was going to be complicated, but it would really only take us about a weekend to complete. So They allowed us to come in and do the migration, and honestly, I think the only reason was because they didn't believe we could do it in that time frame when their consultants had been working on it for almost a year. So Joe and his team jumped in. They did finish it over the weekend and actually delivered it a few hours ahead of schedule. The whole point of this story is really just to kind of go over what we're going to be talking about, right? You want to make sure that you're going to be prepared for a migration. You also want to have the right expectations set, whether that's with your end users or it's with someone like us setting the expectations with you. And then you also want to make sure you have the right people doing the migration so you don't kind of get stuck in this same situation. That really leads us to kind of the first question is, how do you prepare for a migration? On our end, we actually start with our migration questionnaire. It's a doc that we just send out to any of our customers or prospects that are looking to migrate or upgrade versions of SharePoint. It's a pretty simple doc. It just gives us a basis for how difficult the migration is going to be and what approach we're going to take to perform the migration. So there are multiple ways to perform every migration, and Joe's going to talk a little bit about that later. But first, we're going to spend a bit of time on the first thing we all need to know, and that is what's the current version of SharePoint that your farm's at today. So we all know why that's important, but Joe, you want to talk a little bit more about this?
Sure. So yeah, let's just start from the bottom. So if you're on SharePoint 2007, we don't just need to know the major version, 2007, 2010, 2013, etc. We actually need to know the actual build number, and then that's going to tell us what patch level you're at. To get to 2010, SharePoint 2010, you're going to need to be on Service Pack 2 of 2007 ahead of time. 2007 content database cannot be upgraded unless it is Service Pack 2. For the technical folks out there, I'm sure you've heard of the STS ADM tool. And there's one command there that's called pre-upgrade check. And if you're on 2007, you can run that command, and it'll pretty much tell you all the relevant information in regards to migrating. Things like site definition information, language pack information, what features you have in the farm, if any of these features are going to cause issues on the next version, if you have any customized list views, things like that. And probably the most important thing it says is the operating system requirements. So SharePoint 2007 could be installed on 32-bit hardware, but SharePoint 2010 cannot. So if you're currently on 32-bit hardware, you're going to need to stand up 64-bit hardware ahead of time just in order to migrate to SharePoint 2010 in the first place. And that's a lot of times, we're a virtual environment, so we have the ability to stand up intermediate servers to move 2007 databases to a new server and then upgrade from there.
Joe, I'm going to jump in real quick. Get Peter to stop poking me at this point. Just to remind everyone, if you're just joining the webinar, we will make this available online afterwards, so just want to make sure everybody knows that. This is also kind of a good time to just talk a little bit about the second question that we get. And really that is what comes over in a migration and what doesn't. That's one of the things that, again, just about every conversation we have that question.
Yeah, sure. So, you're going to hear us say this a lot, and it all depends on your environment. There's no two SharePoint farms that are the same out there, and everybody knows that. So we primarily just focus on the content. So with your, depending on how many web applications you have, that's going to determine how much content you have for the most part. You could have multiple content databases in one web application, or you could have multiple web applications with only single content databases. But it's all going to be based on the content and the size of that content. And in addition to just the content, we can grab, user profile information, my site content, things along those lines. More often than not, most service applications like search and things like that will be recreated on the new farm, so you don't really need to worry about migrating those. So that basically leads us to a next question. Jesse, what do you recommend to customers who are talking about migrating and who are ready to upgrade?
So one of the tougher topics I would say is really not all that technical, but it's, are you bringing everything over? So just the same way as if you were buying a new home or moving apartments, and you've got the old pair of rollerblades that you wore once back in the 90s, that it's time to get rid of. Use this as an opportunity to clean up your old data. If you're moving to a cloud-based environment, you're paying for storage, and the amount of storage typically affects the price you pay. So you don't want to pay for unnecessary data if it's not needed. The other piece is it also clutters up your sites. So, transitioning to a new clean site often helps with adoption. Users are out there searching and getting a bunch of old docs in their search results. It's going to cause them to kind of question the data that's on the site. So try and only move over what you need. The next question we often get, and really this is an interesting one, is what were others surprised by after the migration? One of the things I tell everybody to look out for here is actually the look and feel. Each version of SharePoint, for those of you that have been around for have used several versions, know that there's a new look and feel to each one of them, and you really need to prepare your users for these changes. I mentioned adoption in the previous point I was talking about, but you don't want to go backwards with user adoption simply because they became irritated, having to learn a new version. It may seem simple to the admins because really they just move buttons around or moved a link here or there, but you definitely want to prep them for the changes. So at this point, Joe's actually looking at me like he wants to jump in, so I will let him.
Yeah, just to add to what you were talking about with the look and feel, the difference between SharePoint 2007 and 2010 is quite different. It's not as different going from 2010 to 2013. With SharePoint 2010, Microsoft introduced what we know as the ribbon bar. So, I mean, that's pretty familiar with what you see in Outlook and Word and Excel and things like that. And just because you're upgraded to, say, 2010 from 2007 doesn't necessarily mean it's going to look like 2010 right away. Site collection administrators can actually get in there and upgrade the look and feel and perform the visual upgrade. And actually with 2013, you can create site collection evaluations. So you can actually create a separate site collection that only you can access, and you can determine, what features are working and how it's going to look, and if you think your users are ready for it.
I'm going to digress just a bit. I mentioned earlier that there were a few different options for doing migrations. Can you kind of go over the different ways that we migrate customers?
Sure. Yeah, let me just start off by saying this can be fairly technical, and if you guys out there aren't able to catch everything, we have written numerous blogs, and you can find those on our blog site at blog.fpweb.net. So going back to the migration methods, there's really three approaches, and we pretty much say they're InPlace, database, detach, attach, and finally third party. Starting with the first one, InPlace Upgrade, that essentially means you're just installing SharePoint 2010 over the top of SharePoint 2007. This is not an option going from 2010 to 2013. The only issue to look out for here is if, like I said earlier, if you're on a 32-bit hardware, you're not going to be able to perform an InPlace upgrade to 2010 because that will not run on 32-bit hardware. So that's also something to look out for. Second option is the database detach attach. This is probably the most common approach to migrations. You have to have a new server with 2010 in place or 2013, depending on what you're upgrading to. And that essentially just means you detach the database from its current environment, move it over to the new server, the new environment. And you don't simply just attach in central admin. You must attach it to the SQL instance, and then from there, use PowerShell to run the mount SP content database command, and this essentially kicks off the upgrade process, and you can monitor that progress in central admin. And we're going to bring Jesse back in here. He's going to talk about third-party option.
Yeah, so there's quite a few third-party tools out there to help migrate data. A few of the more popular ones are going to be Metaviz, Metalogix, ShareGate, and NavPoint. We use these basically to migrate customers from other cloud-based providers, or maybe they don't have access to the data. So if you're currently on a multi-tenant environment that's shared with other customers, you don't typically have direct access to SQL or even the ability to run the commands to get your data that Joe was talking about. So some of these tools will allow you to migrate without having that access. We also use them if we're migrating smaller environments. So if you're getting, if you're moving only a few gig of data, sometimes it's just easier to use a third-party tool, right? Instead of doing everything that Joe mentioned above, a lot of times these tools do a lot of those steps for you. And then finally, for companies that maybe don't have a ton of SharePoint experience on staff, if your site's pretty simple, this is a way to kind of move it with possibly not bringing in outside help. I kind of bring in a word of caution here because, a lot of times after we use these tools, we have to go, and by we, I mean Joe and his team, we do spend quite a bit of time after the migration troubleshooting. So you have to expect there'll be a little bit of time in there spent trying to basically clean up, no matter really what option you choose to migrate. So Joe, why don't you talk about some of the issues and what you guys run into when you're actually troubleshooting after the migration?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I guess the number one issue, and I'm sure some of the technical folks out here have heard of the FAT40 site templates that were created by Microsoft. And, when these came out, everybody jumped on them. It seems like everybody installed them. And, they worked really well for the most part. But, they're pretty much a hassle for migrations, and they cause a lot of issues. And they're not really compatible with 2010 or 2013. And, a lot of the times, most of those third-party providers that Jesse mentioned, actually, if it senses a site is built with a FAT40 template, it won't even attempt to migrate it. So, let's see, there's, let's go into some of the web parts. There's some legacy web parts. If you installed some older web parts in 2007, they may not be compatible with 2010 or 2013, so you have to look out for that. It's always best to contact the vendor of that web part to see if they have any 2010 or 2013 equivalents to install on the new farm. And finally, the the biggest issue we see is customizations, and this can be custom code, custom templates, custom lists. And, like I said, all SharePoint migrations are different. No two of them are the same, so you just have to look out for that kind of stuff. And some of those customizations would probably have to be rebuilt in a new environment. So we gave you a lot of information. I'm sure a lot of you are asking why migrate in the first place. It seems like quite a hassle.
I do feel like we spent a bit of time here talking about how bad it's to migrate and what can go wrong. So it's probably a good question to actually ask, why migrate? And really the answer is that SharePoint's just like every other piece of software. Eventually your version is no longer going to be supported by Microsoft. When that happens, updates stop coming out, and resources, and by resources I mean people, are no longer available to answer questions. So when you run into issues, you're pretty much out of luck, and then you're going to be in that rush to migrate, which is kind of what we talked about earlier. You don't want to be in, right? We want to be able to plan it out. Another reason is simply just being on the latest and greatest version of the software. So I'm not going to get into all the feature differences. We can certainly do that on a future webinar, I guess. But one of the big changes and improvements we've seen is the level of mobile and tablet support. So I know most of us are tied to our smartphones at this point, and these changes definitely help make things easier. And those changes certainly add up if you're more than one version behind. So those are just some of the things you want to think about and reasons you'd want to migrate. So I think with that, we're going to actually turn it back over to Peter and do some Q&A.
All right, yeah, thanks, gentlemen. One topic that you guys did not cover, I noticed, was that it was Joe Byer's birthday today. So, yeah. Yeah, no problem. I'll handle that one. Now, I am going to get into a couple questions here, and I will, without poking Jesse, mention once again that those of you that joined us in the middle of this, this will be available in its entirety on the website soon afterwards, so you'll be able to catch anything you might have missed. But right now, we're going to do a question and answer. I've already got a few questions from you guys, so keep those coming in, and we'll try and get as many of those as we can. A question I have for you guys right away, when we're talking about migrations, like what kind of downtime are we talking about?
Okay, yeah, I can take that one. So like we said, it just depends on the environment, really. The biggest aspect is probably going to be the size of the content. Obviously, it's going to take longer to move 100 gigabytes than it would to move 10 gigabytes. So, the best thing to do is know the size, know if you're on the same network, it's going to go a little faster. If you're using a third-party tool that goes over the web, it's going to take longer. So that's why we send out that migration questionnaire, just to get a good feel of how long it will take.
It's really, just to jump in, since I haven't talked for about 30 seconds, it's really about setting those expectations, right? We mentioned it a little bit earlier. As long as everybody's on the same page, and we kind of give that information up front, and you can kind of prep your users, there's always going to be some sort of downtime. But with that planning, you can usually minimize it, and if the users are prepared, it's not as big of a deal. So,
okay. Those users or our customers, what kind of feedback do you typically get after the migration from them?
I'll take this one. When I was on the relationship management side, one of the big things we saw was in user management. When you jump from, if you're on MOS or WSS currently, any 2007 environment, they actually did a pretty good job of allowing users to, say, change their own password. A lot of that was removed when you go to 2010 and 2013, so now you manage a lot of that through either central admin or you can get a third-party tool. So just something to kind of keep in mind if you are upgrading is that user management piece. I like to throw that out there to customers.
All right. Shiv has a question that has been written in here, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but I think you've actually added a page to our website that kind of touches on this. He's asking, what's the best practices to follow if we migrate WSS 3.0 to 2013 cloud hosting?
Okay, well, first of all, there's no direct migration path unless you're using a third-party tool. If you're on WSS, you have to first bring it to 2010, and then from there you can upgrade it to 2013.
Because, yeah, Matt just asked a question that's similar about going from 2007 to 2013 if you have to go to 2010 first.
Yep, that's correct.
Similar now, Matt and Shiv's question is basically just what's your recommendation for doing that migration from 2007 to 2013, or going farther back with Shiv's all the way from WSS 3.0.
Yeah, so the easiest way is obviously going to be a third-party tool, but those can get pretty expensive. Like I said, we're a virtual environment, so we have the ability to stand up virtual servers and get those to the 2007, then to 2010, and then ultimately to 2013. So there's some free Oracle has a free program out there. We can stand up virtual machines. You can use VMware or something like that, but those are the best options anyway.
And then I believe, not to jump in, but there are some cases, since he was talking about WSS, that you actually have to upgrade that before you can even move to 2010, right? Isn't there, you have to be on like Service Pack 2 or something?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if you're on 2007, you have to be Service Pack 2 first.
Okay, Troy's asking, what criteria should we consider when evaluating migration tools? Do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in for part of this one. When we were evaluating all the tools that we use, one of the big ones for us was what I mentioned in being able to take customers that maybe you don't have access to that data. So you weren't able to actually do an installation on your current server. So one of the big things we had to do is, could you do a migration from simply URL to URL? So the tool that we chose, actually, you can do that, and not many of them can. So there's a lot of that different stuff in there that you just kind of have to be aware of. Joe can go into a bit of it, but that's one thing that we had to take a look at. So if you don't have access to your data, if you're on a multi-tenant farm now, definitely keep that in mind, because you won't be able to run those necessary commands, whether it's the STS ADM, backup commands, or if you don't have direct SQL access, you can't obviously upgrade your databases and pull that data over.
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately what it came down to as well. It's just not having to install something on the source server in order to migrate. There's a lot of them out there. A lot of them had more features than we really needed, but that was part of our evaluation process.
Okay. Troy did have a follow-up question that said, what issues will we face with modified master pages?
That's a good question. It's kind of hard to answer on here. We can get into SharePoint Designer and things like that, but that'd probably be best if we address that kind of offline. It's really hard to answer just by not knowing the specifics.
I think you've got our contact information up on the page, so you can actually email us, and Peter will actually get those questions over. Typically what will happen with a lot of those is there's a lot of follow-ups. When we send the migration questionnaire, when it comes back to us, we typically have a phone call that has either Joe or a member of his team on the phone, and then the technical team from the customer side to kind of go over a lot of those questions, because we hate to do it, but a lot of times we answer that question with another question. So that's kind of what Joe's alluding to.
Sure. Yeah, be sure to reach out, Troy, and we'll be in contact. Let's see here, going down the line here. Geraldo asks, will any of the services be affected, like access services, for example?
Not usually. Like I said, a lot of times we'll reprovision a lot of that. With all the service applications come their own databases. So, it just depends if the customer wants those to come over. We can certainly do that. But out of default, of what we do is pretty much just move the content, things like that.
So as part of the migration questionnaire, and then we also have a build questionnaire on top of it, that's a big piece of it, is understanding what services you're currently using today, and then what services you want to bring over. Keep in mind, each service certainly means that it's going to be taking up resources on your environment. So a lot of times during the actual sales process, we get into those conversations simply because, again, in order to architect your environment properly, we need to know what you're using today, but then also what you're going to be using moving forward. So there's actually a couple different questionnaires that a lot of times we'll go into. And again, it's more of that questions that we're going to be asking when you ask us a question. So, but yeah, we can certainly bring a lot of that over.
Okay, and we do have a few more questions that we are going to get to, but I wanted to, within the half an hour, just in case any of you have to run to another meeting or anything like that, I did want to announce the winner. We've just randomly chosen an attendee that's been there the entire time. So, Mr. Stan Tracy, I appreciate your attendance, and you have won the Microsoft Office Professional 2013. So we'll be in contact with you about that, and we'll make sure you get that. And now jumping back into the questions, let's see. Bonavi asks, from your experience, which third-party tool do you like the most?
Yeah, we can pretty much go into that a little bit. We actually use Metaviz here, and like Jesse said, what it came down to is not having to install web services on the source server. So it allows us, if somebody's moving from a different hosting provider or on-premise even, and maybe they don't have access to the server to actually install those web services and things like that. So with Metaviz, you pretty much type in the URL of the source, type in the URL of the destination, and essentially hit go, and it starts migrating.
Just to add to it, I think Joe mentioned earlier, you do want to reach out to several companies because each one does something a little different, right? So whereas one may not bring over XYZ list, another one will. We've actually, as part of our testing process, gone through and I think of the ones that I mentioned, we've kind of tested each one, and it's kind of odd, but they each do bring over something a little different. And so if you're going to be doing a migration and you want to use a third-party tool, reach out to several of them, and typically they'll give you a demo, so that way you can at least kind of demo. You may not be able to move your entire site, obviously, but you might be able to move just a small piece of it to kind of see how it functions. And again, just as much as any other piece of software, it's about what you're comfortable with from a UI perspective as well when you're actually getting into the third-party tools.
All right, Lucas is asking, when can we install SharePoint 2013 on Windows Server 2012 R2? Is that too vague? Or
no, I'm not 100% sure if it's not compatible yet or not. I know R2 just came out. We haven't tested that yet, so that's something we can look into here in the near future.
Yeah, I was going to say we're still on the initial release, right?
Yeah, RTM or whatever.
Okay.
Okay, and then Slimans asks, do workflows migrate?
Yeah, with the third-party tools, a lot of them do Nintex workflows and out-of-the-box SharePoint Designer workflows. Aside from that, we really haven't had to do many workflow migrations.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that really the answer is yes and no. So
yeah.
It's just like a lot of it, you want to certainly test. If you're using a third-party tool, then you certainly want to test the workflow piece because some migrate workflows better than others do. And then obviously if you're doing the database detach, reattach, then
yeah, those should all come over.
Those come over, correct. So again, it kind of depends on the method of migration. Again, third-party tools, you're going to have to really get in and test each one to know which workflows do come over. We've actually had some where half the workflows come over and half don't, and then we've used a different tool where the other half come over and the initial half didn't. So again, not to complicate things even further for you, but that's kind of why you really want to go in there and test the tool that you want to use. But again, if you use the database detach, reattach, then yeah, they should come over.
Okay, so then Michael's asking, when you migrate from 07, is there a way to preserve the user groups?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a one-off deal, too. There are some default groups that SharePoint 2007 had, and I think they changed names or no longer exist in 2010. But, I mean, as far as users, we really haven't run into a lot of issues with the user groups as far as, SharePoint site-level groups.
Okay, and then Duffy, who likes the slides that I know our graphic designer Mike is going to be happy to hear, he's asking if there is a cost difference between hosted SharePoint 2010 Foundation and 2013 Foundation, and the cost for your migration service to perform the upgrade with no customization.
Sure, I can take that one. There's a little bit of a cost difference, but it's not really in SharePoint itself. It's more in the resources that are needed for 2013. Each version of a software that comes out, it's obviously trying to do things a little differently, right? We talked about the mobile support that's on there. So in order to support the new features, typically the resources on the environment are raised a little bit. So that's really where your cost comes in, not on SharePoint itself, because Foundation is essentially what they call the free version of SharePoint. As far as the migration is concerned, if it's a very simple site, then typically we will do what we call a free migration. And all of our statements of work that we prepare for migrations, what Joe and his team will do is they'll prepare what is essentially a simple migration and then a more complex one. So we try to break it down for the customers, and a lot of times those simple ones will simply do that migration for free for the customer. So I hope that kind of answers the questions. If you have any follow-up, certainly, like Peter said, reach out, and we can certainly jump on a quick phone call to kind of go over it. But yeah, that's kind of the basics of it.
Okay. Troy is asking, what third-party tools do a good job with preserving metadata both when pulling in content or moving content to file shares or new SharePoint locations?
So when we were evaluating these, I mean, obviously we went with Metaviz, but we didn't get into a whole lot of that just evaluating, but we've been using Metaviz for well over a year now, and it's worked very well in terms of moving metadata over and things like that. So we really haven't run into any issues on that side.
Another one I have actually that I come across and that I always reach out to Joe for is when we talk about the different versions of SharePoint, some customers really don't know what version of SharePoint they're on. So this is a good question for you, Joe. How do you actually find out the version of SharePoint you're on?
Oh, sure. So yeah, I mean, obviously you're going to know if you're on 2007, 2010, or 2013. But as far as the build number, we have to match those up if you're moving environments. The easiest way is to go into Central Admin, and there's a servers and farm group there on the Central Admin homepage. So if you click that, you'll actually have a build number, and then you can just go out to Google or something and paste that build number in, and it'll tell you what build and patch level you're at.
And I jumped in for that one just because I get that all the time, and I always forget where I have to go to do that. So, so hopefully that helps as well.
Joel has tweeted us. He's asking, what is the strategy with Fab40? They tell their clients that there's no more application on the new system.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a third-party migration, we essentially tell them that we can't migrate it, so they're going to have to rebuild that site. That's probably not what a lot of you want to hear. But as far as doing a manual migration with the database, Detach or Attach, and even InPlace Upgrade, if you have a Fab40 on 2007, we really haven't had many issues upgrading that. Using a manual method. It's really only a huge issue when you're talking about the third-party migrations.
And then he asks, are there tools to scan your SharePoint 2007 to find if there's customization?
Pre-upgrade check, maybe?
Yeah, the pre-upgrade check will tell you, what features and things you use. And a good way is to go into Central Admin again and look at the farm solutions, and that'll kind of tell you, if you're using Bamboo, it'll say Bamboo on there all over the place. And, that's probably the easiest way anyway.
Okay. Let's see. Have I asked you guys yet? And I think it's been asked a couple times from people. I'm looking at Chris's question, asking about basically what about workflows? Like if those are migrating over. Have I asked that yet?
Yeah, I mean, you asked a little bit about it, and it's again, that's one of those one-off ones because it depends on how the workflow was built. Are you using Designer, using Intex, using K2? What type of tool are you using for that? So some of them are going to come over and some of them aren't. So again, if you're using the third-party tool, make sure you test that piece. If you're doing the detach, reattach, we haven't had a lot of trouble with those workflows. Obviously, the third-party solution needs to be installed on the new farm in order to make sure.
And the other thing that maybe needs reconfirmation is just to make it clear to everyone, when you're migrating from 2007 and you want to get to 2013. Do you have to go through 2010?
Yes, if you do manually, yes. If you're using a third-party tool, then no, it'll go directly.
And that's one of the advantages of that third-party tool. If you can use it, it's great because you can skip that step. Again, like I mentioned earlier, that's where you're going to have probably a bit of troubleshooting to do on the back end, though, because while the third-party tools will move a lot of that stuff, you're going to see some broken links and things like that in there that you're going to have some trouble with. But again, you're basically trying to skip a step by using that tool, right? You're basically skipping over an entire version. So.
And then how long, a couple people, and I see Jennifer's question here, how long is that typically taking? I know you addressed this at the end of the webinar presentation, but kind of from 2007 to 2010 specifically, what kind of?
You mean using third party, or did she know?
Well, it's not clear.
I mean,
I'd hit it from both sides.
I would say from our perspective, it's one of those that's almost impossible for us to just say, hey, here's how long it would take, right? Because there are certain factors that we need to know. We have customers that have 2 gig of data, and we have customers that have 10 terabytes of data, right? So that's a completely different environment, but data is only one piece of it. So another big part of the migration that Joe talked about is going to be the farm solutions that are on there and the third-party web parts, and how many users do you have on there that are coming over. So depending on the size of the farm is really going to dictate how long that migration takes. I mean, they can take anywhere from just a few hours to do to, a couple weeks, depending on when you can also schedule your downtime, right? So part of it maybe we move part of, the databases over at one point in time, and then you do almost an incremental copy, if you will, to get the rest of the data over.
Yeah, just to add, if we're using the third-party tool, I mean, it's going over the web if we're going, if we're pulling somebody from an on-premise solution, let's say. It just depends on the bandwidth on their side, the bandwidth on our side. I mean, there's really no way to tell, and it's really out of our control.
So it's one of those that if you want to call in or shoot us an email, we can certainly get some details from you and probably give you a better idea. Even if you're not looking to move to the cloud, we can probably at least give you an initial, hey, here's what we would estimate something like that would take.
All right, let me read out David's question here. currently running WSS, and can they simply set up a new 2010 foundation farm and move the website collections using STS ADM? Another note, he says that they only have a few sites because WSS is set up as a standalone server for evaluation and usage, and then their demand stored.
So just moving from WSS to Foundation 2010.
The database.
It sounds like he wants.
Well, the main question was if they're running WSS, can they simply just set up a new 2010 foundation farm and move the website collections using STS ADM?
Okay, no, you're going to have to move the whole database and actually upgrade it. If you try just STS ADM backup and restore, it'll actually tell you that the versions don't match up.
Okay. Troy asked, do security groups get migrated?
Yes. I think with third party and manual. Yeah, I mean, we haven't had any issues with it not pulling any security groups over.
And Robin has kind of a use case. They said that they are on SharePoint 2003 and that they want to move to either SharePoint 2007 or 2010. And as Microsoft support for SharePoint 2003 ends in early April, the main concern seems to be associated with server farm issues. So can you share the differences between a 2007 farm and a 2010 farm? And can we do an automated migration from 2003 to 2007 or 2010? Or will we need to do a manual?
I think you'd want to use a tool if you could to get from 2003, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, we had a customer not too long ago coming from 2003, and we used a third-party tool and got them to SharePoint 2010.
I would say from just the perspective that I have, again, one of the reasons you're kind of caught in something I talked about is, you're somewhat stuck on 2003 and being forced to migrate, obviously, because that end of life cycle, and it's really actually coming towards 2007 at this point. So if there's any way you can get to 2010, I would certainly advise that you do that. We actually don't do a lot of 2007 anymore. We'll certainly stand up a server for a customer if they want to do that, whether it's MOS or WSS. But again, I would strongly advise trying to at least get to 2010 if at all possible. And like Joe said, we try to use third-party tools for that, just because again, you're moving even further from back in the day, if you will, when you're talking about 2003.
And jumping around again, because she's asking, do lists created in different versions migrated to the new version? Sorry, let me try and.
So she's just asking, do lists, like would a 2003 list migrate to 2007 or 2010?
Yeah, so yeah, the list in those different versions, are they going to migrate over?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's just part of your data, so absolutely.
Excellent. A couple questions left here that I want to hit. Let's see, Shiv is back. He's asking, what mechanism do you consider if we plan to use forms-based authentication?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, we don't have a lot of forms-based customers, do we? Do you know of any?
I think the ones that we do have, I don't think we've done
had to migrate them.
Well, and I think we've actually done one or two, but we have not used the tools for that. We haven't used any third-party tools when we were doing their migration. It was all done manually.
Yeah, and I do know a lot of these third-party tools will migrate using NTLM and claims off, but as far as forms-based, I'm really not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, so that's something you'll definitely want to bring up if you're investigating a tool to do that. Certainly work with the vendor to make sure that they will migrate that piece. We don't do we don't do a ton of forms-based off. We have some customers that will use that, and we have some that will use SAML and everything else. But a lot of times they'll handle that piece on their side. So definitely work with the tool vendor to make sure they'll handle that side.
Okay, I got one more question. I'll ask you. It's from John. He's asking, when migrating a MOS 2007 environment with custom features and solutions, if the original features and solution files are not available, what tools are available to rebuild the WSP files from the 2007 farm, and which one would you recommend?
Well, a lot of the times with that, we'll, if it's a current customer, we'll have them install those solutions on the 2010 server or on the newer environment before we migrate. Otherwise, if they're no longer needed, we recommend that they delete them from the 2007 environment ahead of time. First tools to move those, do you know of any?
I don't know any offhand that we've used. We can certainly check with the rest of the team and see what they've run into on that. Peter's got your information, so we can certainly see what the rest of the guys have run into on that side.
Yeah, and really, I'm going to stop there. But yeah, if you guys have any further questions, you can keep on tweeting at #FPWebinar. You can also email us. You are going to get the recorded version of this as soon as it's available. So yeah, any further questions, even if it comes to your head in a couple days, yeah, be sure to send those our way and we'll get you the answer. Thank you very much, Joe and Jesse, for coming out here,